11. The slab of stone was split in two. It lay in deep weeds like an open book left on the ground by a giant. One half of the slab was angled on a rise of ground so that it caught the sunlight throughout the day. It was warm to the touch from mid-morning until late evening. When you put your hand to its rough surface and pressed hard, you could feel a faint vibration. Probably just the blood drumming in your own fingertips, but it was like touching the warm hide of some ancient creature sleeping under the ground. Justine liked to imagine a beast buried in the earth. Not buried like the dead, but hibernating, sleeping, ready to wake up one day. She enjoyed sitting here on the stone and eating her rations at midday. The slab lay in the centre of a clearing in the woods, high on the slope of the hill. It was a good place to sit, with a clear line of sight through the trees down to the big house below. There were other, smaller stones and the remains of a wall in the adjacent woods. Justine had studied them and decided that some of them, the newer ones, were merely the ruins of an old farm. The old farm was the best place to be when she wanted shelter, the smells and shadows of the trees. When she wanted to feel the sun, Justine preferred the slab. It was warm now under the torn denim of her Levi's. Sitting here, she would read poetry, laying back, a tuft of weeds for her pillow. Her disc player ran on solar power, and she set it out in the sun beside her head, listening to the few CDs she'd brought with her. Other times, she would read the magazines. Justine was strict with herself about reading the magazines. When she read about the house in them, her excitement would begin to grow, and sometimes she couldn't contain it. The desire would rise in her to see the house. Not the way she could see it now, from the tree line on the hill, but up close. Without conscious thought, she would find herself walking to the edge of the woods. Once, she had even come out of the trees, through the gardens, right up to the old Victorian greenhouse. She had stood there on the overgrown lawns looking up at the house. That had been unwise. So Justine rationed the reading of the magazines and kept her excitement under control. The sun was high now, and she lay back on the stone, watching coloured shapes chase each other behind her eyelids. The shapes were vivid splashes of green and blue on a field of radiant orange. They were unreal colours, romantic colours, like the colours of tattoos. Justine watched them until it was time to eat. Today's rations consisted of sharkwee. She chewed each mouthful slowly, trying to work moisture into the tough strips of dried beef. There was almost no water left in her canteen. Tonight she would have to buy some from a village shop. Their rations were holding out well, but water was heavy to carry, and she'd brought only the minimum with them on their overland trek from London across the North Downs. The walk had taken them 3 days. They could have made better time if Justine had been willing to let Sammy off the leash, a crude length of leather she'd fashioned herself and knotted loosely around his neck. Several times she'd seriously considered dispensing with the leash, but ultimately decided the risk of Sammy running off was too great. Sometimes Justine wondered if she was cruel, but she always dismissed the thought from her mind. Sentimentality could get her killed. Justine began to plan the shopping expedition. It would have to wait until nightfall. She kept a watch on the house during daylight. Each evening, when the sun went down, she abandoned the vigil and went back to her encampment. She read by the campfire while Sammy lay on the ground beside her, whimpering and snorting in his sleep. When the campfire burned low, she would put all thoughts of the house from her mind. Even if the opportunity came, she wasn't crazy enough to try to enter the place after dark. Now, despite herself, Justine found her thoughts focusing on the house, imagining exactly what she might find in it. She forced herself to concentrate on the shopping. It would have to wait until nightfall, and it would have to be a long walk. It was tempting to go to the nearest village to buy water, but she didn't want the presence of a stranger to register with the locals. Word might somehow get back to the house. Justine chewed the strips of spiced dry meat and carefully planned her walk that night. She would find an off-licence or late-night video and grocery store. She'd buy some food for Sammy in addition to the water. She wasn't cruel. This morning, when she'd left their tent, she'd weighed her canteen and poured most of the contents into the old battered tin bowl that Sammy drank from. Now there was only a sip left in the canteen for her, and the charcuterie was dry in her mouth. The muscles in her jaws ached, but she didn't mind. She didn't begrudge the water left in the tin bowl. Sammy was tied to a tree by the tents, and he'd knead it, lapping it up with his big pink tongue in the noon heat. Justine swallowed the charcuterie. It went down a little painfully, but it did go down. Before she unwrapped the next piece, she opened her leather ammunition bag and took out the magazines. When she had bought the bag in London, the man had told her it was a relic of the Spanish Civil War. But that wasn't why Justine bought it. She bought it for the silver skull and crossbones and the silver lettering that said, "Clean up or die." Inside the bag were the covers for the CDs, the rest of her dry rations, and the magazines. She told herself she wouldn't read the magazines yet, but she found herself looking at the covers. The magazines were thin, 40 or 50 pages each, printed on cheap paper which had begun to swell with damp after a couple of nights in the woods. The pictures in the magazines were all black and white. Some of the covers were in colour, but not the one Justine was interested in. On the cover was a grainy monochrome photograph of an old house set in wide, overgrown grounds. Justine looked up from the magazine and through the trees. The photograph had been taken with a long lens from a position very close to where she was sitting right now. Did the thought frighten her? No, it was exciting. She leafed through the magazine, glancing at the article that went with the cover photograph. She didn't read the article. She knew it word for word. Justine unwrapped the second strip of dried meat and put it in her mouth. Her mouth was dry meat too, she reflected as she began to chew. She'd allow herself a sip of water with this one. As she reached for the canteen, she became aware of a faint background buzzing. The sound was so constant it was like silence. She couldn't say when it had started or how long it had been going on. It was a fierce buzzing, and Justine instantly thought of a machine of some kind. She drew the knife from her boot. The line of fracture between two halves of the stone slab was filled with vegetation. Weeds, grass and thin bushes had found their way up to the sunlight through the dividing crack and, over time, had widened it, the massed tiny strength of roots and stems shifting the 1,000 kilos of stone. Justine moved silently up her half of the slab, crawling over sun-warmed stone mottled with fungus. She couldn't see through the growth at the broken edge of the stone. Justine extended the knife and carefully divided the foliage, taking 5 minutes to create a gap she could see through. She spent another 10 minutes looking through. The sound continued all the time, but as she watched, it grew steadily weaker. Finally, Justine stood upright and stepped over the bushes to the other side of the slab. There, by her foot, was a bee. Its black and yellow stripes reminded Justine of the black and yellow capsule she carried with her, sealed in the locket she wore around her neck. The bee was lying on its back on the hot stone, kicking its legs helplessly in the strong sunlight, buzzing as it writhed. Justine studied the insect for a moment, then leaned forward with her knife held out in front of her. Using only the very tip of the blade, with utmost care, she gently tipped the bee over. It crawled around groggily, then lay still. Justine considered for a moment, then went back to get her canteen. There was even less water in it than she'd thought. It made the pale surface of the stone a deep, rich grey as she poured it around the bee, careful not to pour any directly over the insect itself. She kneeled and watched while the bee moved around on the wet patch of stone. For a time, it seemed the bee was growing weaker. At one point, it stopped moving altogether, and she held her breath. Then the buzzing started again, louder than before, and the bee jigged sideways, hovered and lifted into the air. It floated above the stone, then shot away like a bullet. Justine smiled. She lifted the empty canteen to her lips and licked a final drop off the screw thread rim. Taste of metal in her mouth. She breathed the residual cool moisture from the dark tin interior. It didn't matter. It was almost 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock, and then again at 7, it would rain. The rain began 2 minutes late, a drumming on the leaves above her, the leaves of her tree. She was halfway down the hillside now, deep in the middle of the woods. Justine had found the ruins on the morning of the second day of her vigil. Not really ruins, just the traces of foundations and 2 crumbling fragments of dry stone walls. The trees were thickest here, and Justine had found one particular tree that became her own. She estimated that the farmhouse had been abandoned 200 or 300 years ago. There had been a mill here too. She knew that because of the stone. The big circular millstone which someone had left leaning against a tree one afternoon in another century. Leaning against her tree. A weathered old millstone. It was evocative of an older, saner world. Farms, and the sort of farmers she associated with pastoral ad campaigns for wholemeal bread. Justine wasn't fooled. A mill was a machine. It was part of a system of exploitation, a rape that had begun centuries ago and was slowly turning into murder. But there was still a chance to resist. The way the tree was resisting. It was absorbing the stone, the bark slowly enclosing and swallowing it. One day there would be only the tree, and you'd never know the stone had been there. The leaves were heavy with the continuing rainfall, branches bowing down with the weight of it. As Justine moved through the trees, some of the high leaves shed water, a secondary rainfall soaking her combat jacket until it was heavy and cold across her shoulders. The rain had fallen at 3 o'clock, seeded from the clouds by small aircraft. In 4 hours they would fly again, fertilising the sky. It was a sort of machine, really, a water pump in the sky intended to replenish England's parched aquifers. It wasn't natural rain, and it wasn't working. Justine grasped a handful of twigs and pulled the branch down to her face. She held it carefully so as not to tear the leaves off it. Rainwater streamed off the waxy leaf surfaces, spilling down to her open mouth. The leaves were soft on her lips and fragrant. The water was cold on her tongue and had a faint bitterness. It was acid rain from the industrial heart of the continent, the Ruhr and Rhine carried back across the English Channel by the new weather systems. The reversal of the old order. Justine remembered the days when the acid rain had come from England and drifted to the woods of Scandinavia. She thought of days before that, when the rain had come at random and you could drink it, really drink it. Days before she'd been born. The rainwater she was tasting now contained tiny but immeasurable amounts of cadmium, dioxin, lead and plutonium. She drank until her thirst was gone. There were some new poisons in her blood now, and her life was a little shorter. That didn't matter. Justine didn't expect to live long anyway. She wiped the moisture off her mouth and smelled her fingers. After a day in the city, her fingers always stank. Here, in the real world, deep in the wet green, it was different. Justine liked the smell of her hands. She didn't like the way they looked, though. The crude tattoo Isabel had done for her at school with a Bic pen, ugly and blue on the back of her hand. She had long ago acquired proper tattoos. Her first contact with the movement, the real movement instead of the kids playing games, had come through a tattoo artist who had a damp studio above an indoor market in Hastings. There among the biker posters on the peeling wallpaper, with the smell of vegetarian food from downstairs and the pounding of music through the floorboards. He had showed Justine how he traced the tattoo designs off paper from magazines and the covers of old 33 RPM records. and he'd shown her other things. Standing in the woods with the rain falling around her, Justine thought of Alec and the way she'd felt about him at first. She'd been surprised at his pale skin, unmarked, no tattoos on his own arms. He'd lacked the commitment. Just as she discovered that he'd lacked the commitment to the movement. She remembered the way he had looked at first, face close to hers as he put the tattoo on her shoulder with an old electric needle. Then closer still, in bed together. And the way he had looked at the end, eyes open as he sat on the floor with his shirt off, back against the iron radiator. After he was dead, the radiator had slowly burned deep into his back, sending a smell of cooking meat drifting down to the vegetarian cafe. Justine sometimes had dreams about that. Sometimes she cried over Alec. It was quiet in the woods now. The rain had stopped. It would fall again at 7 o'clock. There would be another hour of light after that, and when the light faded, Justine would give up her watch for today. She rolled a cigarette and smoked it. She sat under the canopy of trees, waiting for someone to return to the house in the valley. Waiting for them, and waiting for the automatic rain.